Let's get into it now. A spoiler-free movie review of Napoleon. I will let you know that I had really high expectations going into this movie because look at the cast. In the leading role as Napoleon Bonaparte, you have Jaoquin Phoenix, who is arguably one of my favorite actors still working today. He's been in Her, Walk the Line, he was the Joker, he was in Gladiator. So many movies that I'm always just automatically attaching myself to any new project that he has coming up. And I feel highly invested into seeing how it plays out into his career and where it fits in between all of his movies. You also have Vanessa Kirby playing his wife Joséphine in this movie. You may know her from The Crown. Most recently, just saw her in Dead Reckoning Part 1, and I thought she was fantastic in that. But then you have the director Ridley Scott, who has done movies like Alien, Thelma and Louise, Gladiator, so it's working with Jaoquin Phoenix again. Also movies like Blade Runner, the list goes on, and he's a director who has a very high variety of different types of movies, and I love those type of directors who is really not just typecast as doing one thing really well. He can do action, he can do romantic movies, he can do war movies, he can really do it all. As of late, his last two films I haven't been the biggest fan of, but I thought him taking on the story of Napoleon in a big epic war movie was gonna be his bread and butter. And with a movie like this, I thought it was going to rattle me, and in the end, it didn't really do it. So what this movie was about was the rise and fall of Napoleon, how he went from nothing to having it all and then to losing it all. It takes place in the late 1700s and early 1800s, and you start out getting to see how brutal this movie is. And Kelsey went with me. I told her she would probably enjoy this movie because she loves history, but she didn't want something to be so overly gruesome. And I was like, it's going to be fine. You're going to love it. Within the first 5 minutes, they used the guillotine to slice somebody's head off. And that really set the tone of the entire movie of how brutal it was going to be. The war scenes are very bloody, very detailed, very gruesome, very shocking, which isn't a surprise coming from Ridley Scott, but I honestly thought that was where this movie shined because I feel like this is where they spent the majority of the budget to make these war scenes look really good. The war scenes really reminded me of Game of Thrones, those being the best episodes whenever they spent a lot of money to make those wars and battles look really good. But a lot of the movie dealt with that with Napoleon and the French army and these really crazy battles where there were a lot of casualties and really shows you the recklessness that was Napoleon. And aside from that, the movie served as a character study and a look into the life off the battlefield with his relationship with Josephine, who they had a really troublesome, oh, you would say toxic relationship. But even looking back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, I wonder if this was just the norm. To say the least, their relationship was toxic. There was a lot of cheating, there was a lot of arguments, a lot of abuse, a lot of him being angry at her for not loving him more. So on the forefront, the way all the French people see him is this very powerful, reckless, fearless leader. And then behind closed doors, he is a lot more sensitive than you would expect. Very melancholy is how he describes himself in the movie. The other interesting thing about their relationship and really this entire movie is the weird levels of comedy that I was not expecting. There were just things that were oddly funny in between them arguing that I found the entire theater laughing at. One scene in particular, I had to write down a line where Napoleon said, "Destiny has brought me to this lamb chop." And I just love that line. That was very memorable and just something that I wasn't really expecting for it to have any kind of levity. It did feel a little bit out of place, but I was like, okay, if they're trying to bring some humor into this movie that's relatively dark, dismal, gruesome, and bloody, I'll take it. So when it came to the acting, I don't know if it was just because I expected more from Joaquin Phoenix and Vanessa Kirby for the matter, which I think she was actually the one with the better performance throughout this entire movie. I don't know if it was them and their chemistry or really what I think it was just the nature of this story and trying to depict these characters from the late 1700s and early 1800s. And I just think this is how people acted back in the day because the acting was so subtle. It felt a little bit boring to me. So I really think they were playing the characters right. Just them themselves weren't that interesting to learn about. And I think for me, I already come at a place where I really don't like period pieces, but I'm open to them. I got a little bored here and there. About 90 minutes into the movie, I felt myself becoming more invested and thinking, okay, I think they're getting somewhere. I think there's actually going to be a big payoff here. And then I kind of realized that it was kind of going to be a lot of the same thing. So I didn't really necessarily hate it, but definitely was expecting a lot more. Even when it came to the visuals, there was a lot left to be desired because Apple films right now are crushing it visually. Anything I sit down to watch that comes from Apple, I just know that it's going to have a higher quality to it. I don't know what standards they have when it comes to filming and editing and the cameras they use, but they always just look like a step above what anybody else is doing right now. But when it came to this movie, it felt and looked a little bit generic, like a normal war movie. And I was expecting it to look more like a spectacle, something that demanded the big screen. If not, I could have just waited to watch this on Apple TV Plus when it comes out down the line. Probably goes back to what I said earlier, that they spent so much on the battle scenes that maybe there just wasn't enough money to go around at the end of the day. So I really felt that this movie could have looked better, especially since Ridley Scott worked with a cinematographer that has been his go-to in a lot of his movies that have looked the part. But where the cinematography lacked, I found myself loving the wardrobe. Napoleon had drip. If I was a dude in the late 1700s, early 1800s, I would want that same look. You mean the big, weird looking hat, the emperor uniform? I would want to look like Napoleon. I feel like if this movie would have been 45 minutes less, I would have loved it. I want the opposite of the director's cut. I want all the fat taken out and give me just the meat of this movie and what I need to know about Napoleon, and take out some of the stuff that just felt a little bit boring period piece, especially for a movie that cost almost $200 million to make. They could have saved themselves some cash there. I did love what Ridley Scott said in response to some critics who said the movie wasn't completely historically accurate. He said, "When I have issues with historians, I ask, 'Excuse me, mate, were you there?' 'No.' 'Well, then shut the blank up.'" Which is just funny because you had to take some liberties in making a movie about history. And there was so much research he did while making this movie. And of course, you're going to embellish some things to make them more cinematically appealing. So I don't really have any issue with that. And I just know when going to watch a movie about something that happened in history, it's probably not all going to be down to the facts. If they did, it would probably be a much more boring movie, not just in this movie's case, but any movie in history. So I really don't think this movie is for everybody unless, like me, you're a big Joaquin Phoenix fan or you're just really into war dramas. Kelsey did not enjoy this movie whatsoever. So I think that's also a pretty good indicator of somebody who is not a fan of this type of movie, because it was over the top gory and graphic. There was one scene in particular. There's not any graphic nudity, but there is, what happens. There was a scene that went down, and then 45 seconds later, this family walked in, and I was like, if they would have walked in just a minute earlier, probably looking for the Trolls movie, they would have been traumatized. So that's also letting you know what else to expect from this movie. But in the end, I did find myself enjoying the movie. I just thought it was going to be a movie that would stick with me, especially going into Oscar season. I thought that Joaquin Phoenix would maybe have another Oscar-worthy performance. We would have a Best Director nomination here. I don't even think that's the case. So for Napoleon, in honor of one of the most gruesome scenes in the movie where his horse gets taken out, I give it 3 out of 5 horses.